The Mafia Commission trial was a pivotal moment for the American justice system, as it was the first major case where prosecutors used the RICO Act against organized crime syndicates to convict the bosses that were previously insulated from the crimes they ordered and benefited from. The government, led by then U.S. Attorney Rudy Giuliani, simultaneously went after the heads of each of the 5 families, because every one of them held a seat on the Mafia's ruling board of directors that was called the Commission. There has been plenty written about this landmark trial, along with a few well-produced documentaries, one of which is on Netflix and should be checked out. In this video, we are going to cover the events leading up to the trial and its process, but our main focus will be on the trial's individual effect on each of the 5 families. The Mafia Commission first became known to law enforcement following Joe Valachi's testimony to Congress in 1963. FBI files from that decade describe Carlo Gambino as being part of it. In 1970, the Racketeering Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as RICO, was passed by Congress. This law made individual members of criminal organizations responsible for the crime committed by the larger organization, even if this person did not commit the actual crime. An example would be a mob boss who orders a murder, but an underling pulls the trigger, or an underling who commits hijackings for the organization while benefiting from the spoils of the larger crime ring. In order to be convicted in a RICO case, the prosecution must prove that the defendant is a member of a criminal organization and that they participated in a pattern of racketeering activity. Racketeering activity is defined in RICO as committing, attempting to commit, or conspiring to commit a list of predicate crimes that are part of organized crime activity. To qualify for a RICO indictment, a person must commit 2 racketeering acts within a 10-year period. While the concept of an individual being charged with a crime that an organization carried out might seem unfair, the Supreme Court has upheld the RICO Act on numerous occasions. The RICO Act was primarily drafted by Notre Dame law professor G. Robert Blakey while he worked as a counsel in the U.S. Senate. But in the years after its passage, it was largely ignored by law enforcement as they didn't really understand it. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, Blakey was actively promoting the act through lectures and training seminars with Department of Justice lawyers. But most prosecutors were skeptical about being the first ones to use the legislation, as it was untested in a courtroom, and they did not want to lose a case they brought forward. During this time, multiple law enforcement organizations were pursuing their own independent investigations of the 5 families in New York City, and 1983 was when everything began to converge for what would become the Commission trial. The FBI had individual task forces assigned to each family. The Lucchese family task force secretly planted a listening device in powerful capo regime Salvatore Avellino's car. Avellino ran the Long Island crew, and he would frequently chauffeur family boss Tony Ducks Corallo from his Long Island estate to New York City for business. The conversations they had would form a key block of the prosecution's evidence. The FBI also planted a listening device in Gambino family boss Paul Castellano's house. In addition to mob business conversations, they also discovered that he was having an affair behind his wife's back with the maid. The task force had also planted a listening device in a Colombo family hangout, but it was shortly afterwards discovered. Members also had their phones wiretapped. Another key development for this trial in 1983 was the release of Joe Bonanno's autobiography called A Man of Honor. In here, he described the history of the Mafia and the development of the Commission. Then U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Rudy Giuliani, read the book and realized that Bonanno's description of the Mafia fit the perfect depiction of a criminal organization under RICO. He flew to Arizona to try and get the original commission member to testify, but he refused to talk and was rewarded with a brief prison sentence for obstructing the investigation. But his written words were enough to help the prosecution. Through the wiretaps and listening devices, prosecutors initially charged 12 men that they believed they could prove to be members of the Mafia. Next, for a racketeering activity, again based from the recordings, law enforcement was given an inside look of what would be known as the Concrete Club. Here, the family bosses on the commission were manipulating the New York area construction industry through the large concrete contractor companies. Any job bid over $2 million needed to go to the commission for approval, and it was they who decided what the bid amounts would be, and then who would get the awarding of the contracts. If the job was less than $2 million, then the mob kept their hands off it because other people need to eat too, as Corallo put it. There was plenty of conversations about the concrete business and the coordination with other families. A contractor would normally charge $60 for a cubic yard of concrete, but for the bid, they would mark it up to $64, and the mob would get the $4 difference. The businessmen that made it into the Concrete Club were also happy with the arrangement because it guaranteed projects for them, while at the same time increasing construction costs on consumers by between 5 and 10%. Also damning for the family bosses was that in 1982, the FBI learned of a commission meeting that was going to take place at a house in Staten Island. On May 15th of that year, they captured photos of Paul Castellano, Tony Ducks Corallo, Colombo family acting boss Jerry Langella, and Fat Tony Salerno leaving the location, which was later presented of proof of the commission's existence. In the winter of 1985, the government made its move and arrested the heads of the 5 families, plus members of their upper management. 9 men were originally indicted, and 3 more were shortly added to the list. During that year, developments plus new information would alter who was in the final defendant's docket. In the end, it was 8 members with 7 sentenced to 100 years in prison and 1 sentenced to 40 years. The Mafia was now believed to be leaderless, and the conventional wisdom was that without their bosses, Cosa Nostra would slowly die. Except it didn't. Here is how the trial's outcome affected each family from least to most impacted. Following the revelation that Donnie Brasco was an FBI informant, the Bonanno family was kicked off the commission in the early 1980s. Although boss Philip Rastelli was initially indicted in the case, prosecutors later removed him. That's not to say that he escaped from the fallout unscathed. He had been in prison since the summer of 1984 due to a parole violation, and in 1986 he was convicted of 24 counts of labor racketeering with a sentence of 12 years. In 1991, he was granted compassionate release due to liver cancer, and he died 3 weeks later on June 24th. Rastelli was succeeded by his protege Joe Massino, who was also in prison at the time. When Massino was released, he shook up the family by banning social clubs and other regular mob hangouts where the government could plant listening devices. The family thrived during the 1990s, but when the 2000s arrived, Massino's luck ran out. One captain became an informant, and it created a chain reaction with mob members all turning on each other. The final domino to fall was Massino himself, who has the notoriety of being the first boss from the 5 families to become a government informant. A violation that he used to have people killed for breaking. Anthony Bruno Indelicato, who has the nickname of Whack Whack, was caught up in the trial due to his role in the murder of Carmine Galante in 1979, which was proven through circumstantial evidence to have been authorized by the Commission. At the time of the trial, Bruno was on the outs with boss Rastelli and Massino. He was sentenced to 40 years, but was released in 1998. He has been in and out of prison since and is now rumored to be the family's consigliere. But overall, the trial did not really hurt the Bonanno family. They were in a bad position prior to it due to years of discontent and civil war. In the years following the trial, they became much stronger until everything came crashing down 20 years later. In this case, both boss Paul Castellano and his underboss Agnello Della Croce were indicted, but neither man would live to have their day in court. Della Croce died of lung cancer on December 2, 1985. In the months leading up to this, tensions were rising between Castellano and Capo Regime John Gotti over wiretap tapes that had Gotti's friend, Angelo Ruggiero, discussing heroin deals. Castellano had continued Carlo Gambino's policy of death for those dealing drugs, and these tapes could get both men killed. Della Croce was a mentor to Gotti and refused to give his blessing for Gotti to go after Castellano as a presumptive move because the rules state that you cannot kill a boss. But this rule has a Gambino family tradition of being broken when convenient, since former leaders Vincent Mangano and Albert Anastasia were each murdered. With Della Croce gone, Gotti was free to act, and when Castellano did not go to his underboss's wake or funeral out of concern that it could hurt him in the trial, Gotti was able to sway the rank and file to his side. Exactly 2 weeks later, on December 16th, Gotti made his move. 4 hitmen shot Big Paul and his driver Tommy Bellotti. Bellotti was Castellano's protégé and was promoted by Big Paul to be the family's new underboss. An emergency meeting of the family's captains was called, and Gotti was elected to become the family's new boss. Joseph N. Gallo was the family's consigliere since Carlo Gambino promoted him in 1967. He was almost 74 when these events happened and agreed to stay for the sake of transitioning the organization to new leadership. He retired officially in 1987. Less than 10 years later, the family's entire leadership would be indicted and put in prison, minus underboss Salvatore Gravano, who became a state's witness after hearing wiretaps about what Gotti was saying about him. Gotti refused to relinquish his title despite being in a maximum security prison, and he made his son, John Jr., be the acting boss. Gotti's takeover and reign probably did more to hurt the Gambino family in the long run than the commission trial would had Castellano not been murdered. Big Paul was the only member facing the prospect of a long prison sentence, while everyone else was safe from the fallout. It was clear, too, that he had been grooming Tommy Bellotti to take his place. If Bellotti had lived, then things might be very different in today's Cosa Nostra. This list is being structured so that it starts with families least affected and it ends with the ones that were damaged the most. It's fitting that the Genovese family is put in the middle. Anthony Salerno, also known as Fat Tony, was named as the boss of this family, and he was sentenced to 100 years in prison. He died in 1992, but the mob had deceived the government, and Salerno was a good soldier that took his punishment without a complaint. In reality, he was the family's front boss. Former boss Philip Lombardo created the position sometime during the 1970s to divert the attention of law enforcement, and this ruse worked. The Genovese were so successful that it wasn't until 1992, when government witness Vincent Caffaro came to them, that they realized they were deceived. The man with the power behind the throne was Vincent Gigante, who went by the nickname of the Chin. In fact, to protect himself, members were never allowed to repeat his name for fear of the government hearing. Instead, If they were referring to him, then they needed to rub their chin without saying a word. Behind closed doors, Gigante was a ruthless and cunning boss, but in public, he disguised himself as a mentally feeble man that would wander around Manhattan's streets in just a bathrobe. The hope was that a jury would never convict a mentally ill person for being the boss of the largest family because the image just seemed so absurd. Gigante spent the first half of the 1990s being indicted for various crimes and having his lawyers argue that he was mentally impaired and could not stand trial. In 1996, he was determined to be mentally sound. The following year, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison for plotting murders and running rackets. It was a light sentence that the judge claimed he gave to show some leniency due to Gigante's old age and then frail physical state. He did not live long enough to be a free man again and died in 2005. It's believed that he was succeeded by Liborio Bellomo, who is still the current boss. While the leadership of the Genovese family remained intact, Fat Tony Salerno was far from being just a patsy. He was a powerful mobster in his own right, and East Harlem was his private kingdom. New York Times crime reporter and author Selwyn Raab notes in his book Five Families that while he might not have been the official boss, Salerno was a member of that family, and he coordinated the Concrete Club, plus he was the Genovese's proxy to the Commission, which makes him guilty of everything he was convicted for. For the Colombo family, the Commission trial saw the family's boss, Carmine Persico, receive a 100-year prison sentence. But at just 48 years old, he decided that he did not want to retire and would instead run things from the can. Persico became the official boss of the family in 1973 while he was in prison, so he had experience managing the family like this. In fact, during his entire reign, he was only on the actual streets between 1979 and 1981, during which most of the time he was living as a fugitive for violating his parole. When the Commission trial began in 1985, he was in the process of serving a 5-year sentence for conspiracy to bribe an IRS agent. Jerry Langella was Persico's underboss, and the man was one of the few people that Carmine trusted. But he was also a defendant in the Commission trial, which took him off the streets permanently. The only other member of the family caught up in the trial was soldier Ralph Scopo. Scopo was heard on wiretaps before discussing how he worried that the bosses would have him killed if he was ever arrested for his activities coordinating the Concrete Club out of fear that he might flip against them. Instead, the whole group was caught up together, and he received 100 years along with everyone else. He died in 1993. Persico turned to his brother Alphonse to become the acting boss, but shortly after that, he was arrested for loan sharking. Next, Persico named a 3-man ruling panel to manage the family, but in 1988, he dissolved it and put Brooklyn Capo regime Victor Orena in the top role. Orena was meant to be a placeholder until Carmine's son, known as Little Alley Boy, would be released from prison. But once Orena got a taste of power, he decided, with perhaps the backing of Gambino boss John Gotti, to make a move to take over the entire family. He decided to do it peacefully by calling a meeting of the family's capos to make his announcement. Consigliere Carmine Sessa alerted the Persicos about this move, and they directed their loyalists on the outside to hit Orena. The attempt was unsuccessful, and what happened next would be known as the Third Colombo War. It will be a future video, but the short story is that the Persico faction won, and Little Alley Boy became the new acting boss in 1996. A year later, he would be back in prison and would never leave. Carmine Persico remained the official boss until his death in 2019, while a revolving door of men would serve as the street boss. After he died, longtime Persico loyalist Andrew Russo took the top spot until he passed away 3 years later in 2022. Persico's nephew, Skinny Teddy Persico, is believed to be the family's new boss. While the family was still powerful following the commission trial, Carmine Persico's desire to maintain his role while in prison handicapped the family's leadership, which led to a civil war. This violence increased law enforcement's scrutiny of the group, which led to massive indictments during the 1990s and 2000s. While it is still a powerful force in the underworld, the Colombos are a shadow of what they used to be. The Lucchese family were the most damaged of the 5 families following the Mafia Commission trial. Boss Tony Dux Corallo, underboss Salvatore Santoro, and consigliere Christopher Fornari were all indicted and convicted to 100 years in prison. As Corallo's primary driver, he might have at one point wanted Sal Avellino to take the top role from him someday. But Avellino was young and had only been a capo for a year. He was also facing his own separate legal problems because of the car recordings, plus there was probably some resentment that it was his car in which they were all secretly recorded. It became clear to the family's upper management that with the 3 of them all facing long prison sentences, the best thing for the family's interest would be new leadership. The big question was, who was it going to be? Corallo favored capo regime Anthony Luongo. Fornari favored his own protégés, Vittorio Amuso and Anthony Casso, who had the nickname Gas Pipe, as that was one of his favorite tools to use when things needed to get violent. Luongo disappeared in 1986 and is believed to have been murdered by the pair. With no better choices, Corallo tapped Amuso and Casso. It's believed that Casso was his preference to be the new boss, but instead Casso declined the top role and insisted that it be Amuso. So Amuso became the new boss in 1987 when Corallo, Santoro, and Fornari began their sentences, and in 1989 he named Casso as his underboss. 2 words that can describe the new era of the Lucchese family would be violent and greedy. Their reign saw what was arguably the most stable family become the most chaotic, with betrayals, murders, the mafia cops, and much more that will become a future video topic as well. Both Amuso and Casso would end up in prison for the rest of their lives, and to this day, Vic Amuso is still the official boss at 90 years old, while he remains in prison. The Mafia Commission trial and the use of the RICO Act was a fatal blow to Cosa Nostra. While it didn't destroy Cosa Nostra with one blow, it initiated the process for its decline. Even a family like the Bonannos, who were initially unscathed, would find themselves nearly destroyed 20 years later thanks to the relentless pursuit and pressure from law enforcement. But while the Mafia might not enjoy the same peak of power that it held in the 1980s, it still exists and remains a powerful force in the New York City underworld.